Welcome to another episode of Tax Leaders Unplugged, a podcast about learning from the best tax leaders out there. My name is Stevi and I'm your host for today. And in this podcast series, we have casual though thought-provoking conversations with the best in-house tax professionals. And we aim to unlock learnings from them for you. So stay tuned if you want to grow as an in-house tax professional or if you want to be inspired by your peers or just enjoy a very entertaining chat about tax. In today's session, we welcome Steven Bosmans, the VP of Global Tax and the Chief Tax Officer at Avnet, a US multinational and a Fortune 500 company. And Avnet is a global technology solutions company that is existing for more than 100 years already and has headquarters in Phoenix, Arizona. And Steven is now 20 years with Avnet. He's based in Belgium. And I know Steven from my years at Avnet. So he used to be my reporting manager some 10 years ago. Steven started his career back in the days at the tax authorities, where he worked for 2-3 years. And then he moved to the advisory side of things to Arthur Andersen and then Deloitte before he moved in-house. And other than his in-house activities right now as a tax leader, Steven is also a member of different industry groupings like the Tax Executive Institute, the Belgium In-House Tax Forum, and the Tax Executive Council of the Conference Board. Welcome, Steven.
Thank you.
So, Steven, to get started, outside of the tax world, what are some of your hobbies and interests that people might be surprised to learn about?
The surprise is a stage word. Anyway, but so I spend some time on the bike. I cycle a lot. Some people say a lot, some people compared to others not, but just to stay in shape. And because I love it, it's always good. Ride with a group of friends. And while you're cycling, you can talk about different things. So that's one thing that I do. Maybe what people might be a bit more surprised about is that I've always thought it's important to connect with local society. So I have always been engaged in local nonprofit organizations. Currently, I'm still member of a board of a local nonprofit organization that promotes artists and local craftsmen. Before that, for a long time, maybe 20, 25 years, I was also a board member of the local tennis and padel club. And maybe something worth mentioning is that some 25 years ago, we decided with that club to start a campsite at the music festival, which is close to where I live. And the campsite is a pretty big one. It's about 25,000 campers every year that come there. In the beginning, we did everything from A to Z, including the build-up, the cleanup, and everything like that. So now the campsite is under the Live Nation umbrella, the organization of the festival itself, but we are still involved in the operations of the campsite. So something different than tax, that's good.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear. I'm always amazed how you can combine your already busy schedule as a tax leader with all those non-tax stuff. I get the cycling activity, yeah, that's good to stay in shape. And I'm following you on Strava. I can tell to the audience. It is impressive. I know you as a very humble person, but I think you are quite impressive when it comes to the overall activity you have over there. With respect to the other activities you mentioned, the engagement for the local sports club, or even more than the engagement for the organization of the campsite at Rock Werchter, what do you typically like to get out of that? What drives you to do it? And do you think there is a spillover between leadership skills that you have in the tax world that you also use outside of the tax world in those organizations, or the other way around? Anything you can share there?
I think it goes both ways. With my background as economist and then accounting and tax, I've always had the responsibility for all the finance related aspects of those nonprofit organizations. So that's definitely something that goes into that way. The other way around is it also gives you a lot of satisfaction of being around people that have totally different backgrounds than what we typically deal with in the tax world in-house, but also with advisors. Typically, people have the same background, and that is not the case there, where we promote our local artists. You deal with artists, which are, we sometimes are calling ourselves artists in the tax world, but that is something totally different. It gives you a better view of what is going on in the rest of society as well. And on the other hand, I think I just also need the social contact to talk to people, to be engaged.
That makes a lot of sense because we as tax people, we need to deal with a lot of stakeholders. By nature, we tend to be social because we need to deal with our internal stakeholders, our advisors, and the tax authorities. So we are surrounded by people all the time. So that makes sense that outside of your professional context, you build relationships with people. If you were not in the tax domain, what would be your career if you would not have ended up in tax?
Maybe when I go back to when I was 18, I needed to make a decision. It was either economics or dentistry. So probably if I would have not chosen economics and ultimately ended up in the tax world, a dentist. Of course, with all that experience at the campsite for 25 years now, building or doing something in the world of entertainment, but more at the not on the stage itself, but in the background. Maybe that might be something that I started to get an interest of, but definitely not when I was 18.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like dentist versus tax is a different profession. All right, Steven. So I find it always fascinating that you are like a Belgian-based head of tax, even a chief tax officer for a US Fortune 500 listed multinational. What are in your eyes like the opportunities or the challenges that this is bringing? Like, yeah, you being based in Belgium, you obviously travel a lot, I can imagine, but you are overseeing a global team and then also being part of an organization where the headquarters is in the US. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
So maybe a couple of opportunities. First of all, Europe is time zone wise in between the US and Asia. So
yeah.
kind of cover all the regions within a reasonable working day.
Yeah.
Well, maybe
it's a long working day, but yeah.
It might be, yeah, indeed. But that's a very practical thing. Further, I think Europeans look at tax a little bit different. Tax within a multinational than in the US. We look at it more as a value-added business advisory function rather than a compliance function. Quite some years ago, that was the view of the US groups typically. So bringing this to also other regions, and we already implemented that in EMEA quite some time ago, being really the business support and business advisor. But bringing that to the other regions as well has beneficial for the global team, for the teams in those regions, but also for the overall organization. So I think that is an opportunity to copy paste what you do in Europe to the other regions.
Yeah.
Of course, there are some challenges. Not being a US tax specialist as such, responsible for a US multinational is a challenge because, as you know, and a lot of people in the audience will know that everything that you do and is in a US group, everything that you do anywhere in the world may have a US tax impact. So you need to make sure that you have a good US tax expert in the team to guide you. And then as a CFO and the rest or all the C-suite mostly is in the US, you're not very close to them on a day-to-day basis. It's important to keep yourself informed of what's going on at that level. You need to have some discipline on regular touch points and really taking the step to ask whatever is going on and not just wait until you hear something, and that's important. Linked to that, the visibility of the tax function to the CFO and the C-suite may be a little bit lower because the tax leader is not there. So that requires some additional efforts, but I think pretty good. I've established a good way to do that. I started this role beginning of 2020, just before the COVID pandemic. So we all had to learn to do things virtually and from a distance. So
when you said that European tax leaders are more used to having that business advisory role, is that something where you can already see that you are able to bring that to the other regions? And how do you then do so? Because I hear you, and from the previous podcast episode also with Carl Berlin, that was one of the bigger learnings that he was sharing with the audience, like the importance of being very close to the business and having that seat at the table in all projects and having that line of sight on the business. But how do you, in practice, bring that to non-European team members that are maybe less familiar with that aspect and the value add that you have as a tax function?
Yeah, so first of all, it needs to come from both ways. The tax team or the people within the team, they need to be open and willing to do that. But I think that when people get a little bit further in their career, you just don't want to sit on your desk and do tax calculations and Excel. It's definitely a development that people are willing to take. So that's the first thing. You need to make sure that your team is willing and able and ready for that. But then you also have to work on the other side, the other part of the organization and the other functions, for them to be open to, for tax to talk to them by providing them with things that we have seen, for instance, in Europe, when I was, before this role, I was responsible for the European tax operations in Avnet. There is a very good cooperation, and you can say, hey, talk to the leadership in Europe and how they perceive that and what the benefit is that we have given them. And then, it opens up their eyes as well. People are generally open to having discussions. What is very important to mention to the non-tax people is to make sure that you're not there to block everything they want to do and say, no, it's not possible from a tax perspective. Hey, we're here to help find the right way to do it in a compliant way. That's important to mention.
Making them understand what's in it for them, that you are there to support the same company-wide objectives as they are, and that you are seen as a business partner, hopefully in the end. I've been there myself. I know how challenging it can be. One of the aspects of being that the tax domain is so complex and we speak a very different language than our stakeholders. Bringing that message and value across is not always straightforward. It's not always easy, you mentioned.
That is one of the main roles for a tax leader, the head of tax, is to explain those complex things in an understandable way for non-tax people, at least for them to get a feeling of what's going on and what we're dealing with. So,
yeah. And you already touched upon like the challenge there is with respect to reporting to the C-suite, the CFO, whereas these people, in your case, they are not in the same region as you are. How do you deal with that very practically? Like, do you have daily touch points, weekly or regular touch points? Is that mostly then with Teams calls or emails or chat? Any tips there? Because I think in the end, like that, having that good relationship with the CFO is very, very important. Everybody will agree. I think the CFO has some knowledge of tax, but not always the same level. So how do you make sure that the CFO understands what is happening, understands your objectives, where you want to go?
So we have, of course, what they call CFO staff meeting, everyone reporting to the CFO on a regular basis. That's bi-weekly. I also have a one-on-one every other week. So ultimately, you talk to each other every week, not on a daily basis. Even if you would be in the same office, not jump into the office of the CFO on a daily basis. If there is something that needs to be urgently discussed, you can always reach out. But I want to also within my team try to avoid is doing only like email correspondence or chat correspondence. Even if it's like a 15 or a 10-minute discussion required, go on Teams or Zoom or whatever you use the camera as well, so that it is at least closer to your face-to-face meeting.
That's interesting, because you sometimes hear people that rather promote an async way of working, where they are like, we are not going to use the camera too much. We rather do it quickly with a chat so that everybody has a time to read your question or whatever you want at their preferred moment. Whereas you are promoting a bit more the synchronic way of working, right?
That is true, but of course you need to take into account time zone differences, of course. So you need to keep that in mind. But as long as there is a time zone overlap, then that indeed, I promote that much more. The other thing is what I find important is what you would do when you would be all in the same office is that small talk, and you would never do that when typing an email. So I think it's important to get a feeling of, okay, we know each other and we see each other on a regular basis.
That's a very important thing. I think you touched upon those water cooler moments that we used to have back in the days when we were all in the same office, but now when we are working in the digital environment are far less obvious to have. How do you deal, because for you it's like a global team, and then in a very digital environment, how do you make sure indeed that you have that bonding, that you know also as a global leader what's going on in all of your regions, and that you at least have a bit of a feeling of how your team is performing, how they are feeling, how you can also push them towards their personal development? Any tips you can share there? Any practices that you apply in your team?
So first of all, indeed, the biggest challenge is to make sure that you know how the team is doing, how they get connected or keep connected and trained and developed. But how to do it, it requires discipline, not only with your direct manager, but also with the whole team, having kind of fixed touching points every week with each of my direct reports. And then also with the global teams, all my direct reports together, so everyone knows what they're dealing with. So it requires discipline, but not only with your direct reports, but also with the rest of the team. Not necessarily every week, because then don't do anything else, but just try to get a feeling of what's going on. And in your daily or weekly touch points, the intention is not only to talk about technical things, but also about, okay, how the team is doing, or are there any challenges, and these kind of things. When you're in an office, like in the past, you know that, Stevie, because you were in the office opposite me, I try to have an open door policy. So unless you have meetings, everyone can just jump into your office. And you can kind of do that in a similar way, but then saying, hey, if I'm not in a meeting, then you can always reach out. You can call me on Teams or whatever, directly, video call, whatever. So kind of have a virtual open door concept.
And what I also liked is that your door was always open, but at the same time, you learned me as well, like, I don't necessarily need to hear from you. You don't need to copy me in your emails, but I'm always there for you when you need me. And I always remember that as a very valuable lesson from a management perspective that gave me, on the one hand, a lot of responsibility and autonomy to do my work, but I also could rely on you whenever I had a question on one or the other topic. So I like that as a leadership principle that you applied there.
And I think that has not changed since you left.
Yeah. And maybe the other thing which I still recall is, like, do you still have those global offsites? And can you elaborate a bit on the agenda there? Because I found it fascinating how there was a mix between the tax technical stuff, but also I remember you invited business leaders in those offsites. That was very inspiring to also keep that relation with the business.
Right. Well, first of all, although the world has become much more virtual, having physical meetings on a regular basis is important. And we all know that in the COVID period, we tried like virtual after work drinks or this kind of thing, but it's not really the same. Anyway, so still having regular physical meetings is important. In the past, over a couple of years ago, it was paused basically, but the intention is to, on a biannual basis, bring the whole teams together in one location. So global teams in one location. We had one in April of last year in Phoenix in the US. And basically, so there it's kind of like the same principle. We try to combine having some tax technical content, but also so both internally as well as inviting some advisors to talk about, okay, what's going on in the tax world and so on. And then, of course, in-house or internally, it's more about processes and the working together and how things are being done in Asia versus Europe versus Americas, and then learn from each other. But then also spend sufficient time on, let's say, asking leaders, CEO, CFO, or whoever is available to come and talk to you and to say, hey, this is going on in my part of the organization. Okay, the CEO, that's the whole organization. But then also asking them, what can we add, or how can we help in your world, basically, right?
So a very interesting concept for all tax teams to have on the agenda, like invite those business leaders or business people to your tax meetings and make sure that you have the bonding, but also maybe a mutual understanding of each other's agenda and where your company is going versus what the tax objectives are. So yeah.
I think, of course, it's very difficult to ask a CEO to spend like half a day with you. So if they can give you an hour or an hour and a half, you want them to talk rather than us presenting to him what's going on.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Very clear. I think, quite some interesting takeaways already. Steven, so you are head of tax or the chief tax officer for a US-based multinational. You're Europe-based, Belgium-based. Like, what are, in your eyes, differences how US multinationals versus European multinationals look at taxes in general, how they manage them, how they deal with them? Any insights you want to share there?
Yeah, sure. There's a couple of different points. So first of all, there's a difference in focus, I think, right? US multinationals, there's still a significant focus of the organization on ETR, ETR management, we call it. So ETR for me, for my whole team, is still an important KPI. While in Europe, the focus has shifted more towards good tax governance, sustainable tax positions. Carl mentioned it last time in your podcast, risk management, tax in ESG in general, and these kind of things, where just bluntly looking at ETR is no longer the case. Well, of course, this is no longer the only thing in the US multinational as well. But that's kind of like a difference in focus as such, I think. And then secondly, there is, as you mentioned, an operational difference that I've seen and experienced, is that in the US, if there is the word tax in it, then it's for the tax function. And it's your issue. You need to figure out where you get the information, what do you need, how you do it, when, whatever. It's your problem. You need to, the ERP system is there. You just log in and you try to find whatever is required. While in Europe, tax is much more managed throughout the whole organization. So the tax function may still be responsible, but there's a lot of different functions that touch the process. Call it a multifunctional responsibility. A lot of tax work is initially done by the finance teams and the accounting teams. That's definitely a difference operationally.
Touching first on the first difference you explained, do you see an evolution that there is also a shift from the more financial KPIs to what you said, like the ESG system? Or is it still like light years of difference between Europe and US?
Going into the same direction. One region may be a bit further getting into that direction. And that's one of the opportunities you can see from having a European as a global head of tax for a US multinational. You may be able to expedite that process. But no, it's not a standstill there either. That's clear.
And I think so, as you said, is that something that you actively also are promoting then, that from let's say, the benefits of having a focus on the less financial KPIs, but more sustainable and ESG around governance and maybe risk management? Is that something we're pursuing in terms of convincing your C-suite of having that shift in focus?
Well, the world is becoming more complex and tax planning is no longer the same as like 10, 20 years ago. So really managing the ETR is no longer easy. And also, of course, we want to have a sustainable tax positions. We will not do anything if it's not more likely than not that we can maintain our positions. So definitely that is the case. Now I see as well, in view of my CFO, is that he's less maybe than the prior one, focused on reducing the tax expense in the P&L as much, but making sure that it is stable, relatively stable, so that at least towards the investors, he doesn't have to explain the big fluctuations. Focus is getting a little bit more to that.
That's interesting, because that is a very important one, definitely for listed companies. You contribute more and more to the storytelling they are having to the investors, so that your chief investor relations or CFO in the investor calls is having, and where obviously the focus more and more is on ESG, which include the tax component and the sustainable tax behaviors. That makes a lot of sense. Steven, there is one thing which I find very interesting when I look at your role and your title. You're carrying both the VP Global Tax title with the Chief Tax Officer title. And in particular, the Chief Tax Officer title is something which catches my attention. There are not that many Chief Tax Officers out there. At the same time, you see, for example, the Chief Legal Officer. What is the reason why you have those titles? And then secondly, do you see somehow a benefit of it? Would you further promote it? Does it have a value in your organization? Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, sure. The reason, it's a good point. I never had to really negotiate on it. My predecessor also carried that title. Maybe that was helpful. But when I talked to, at that point in time, my CFO, when I was applying for this job, I told him about how I see the tax role. I wanted to be more than just focusing on managing the income tax line in the P&L, but really being a leader with a view of what is best for the company, rather than just looking at the tax line. And also being in contact with business leaders, C-suite, board of directors. Title may help on that a little bit. Now, on the other hand, it definitely depends on the company that you work for. Maybe in some companies, it doesn't really matter what title you carry, right? And in other companies, it may be required to open the doors to talk to senior leadership. The officer part of that title more relates to focusing on the company and putting the best interest of the company first, rather than purely on the tax line. The best interest of the company may have a negative impact on the tax line, but that's only like 25% of the total profit. So that's what I think is important. You're also saying, I don't want to promote that. Why not? I would say it doesn't harm promoting the use of that title. Maybe in some companies, it may open more doors. And as taxes become more and more important, or at least touch all kinds of parts of the organization, being not only direct tax, but also indirect tax, transaction taxes, maybe with subsidies, incentives, which are governing the world now. So they touch all those aspects. It's important for someone in this role then to have some power and influence in your organization. And maybe in some organizations, that title may give you a little bit more of that influence.
Yeah.
And in others, it may not matter what title you carry.
Does it impact your reporting line, you think, as a tax leader, whether you are a head of tax, VP tax versus a chief tax officer, or is it still mostly in line with expectations, the CFO, you would say?
Well, I haven't seen any tax person not reporting either directly or indirectly into the CFO. But, well, you said maybe provoking, maybe if tax touches more and more embedded into the business organization, maybe in a number of years, a chief tax officer may report to a CEO and be part of the C-suite, like a chief legal officer today. That's maybe a very provoking thing. But it will also depend on how the CFO role evolves over time, because the CFO is not only a finance person anymore, he's also a very important business advisory role. So anyway, maybe not in the rest of my career anymore, but
yeah. No, but I like the fact that the reporting line directly into the CEO for tax could potentially be a thing of the future. As tax gets closer to the business, maybe that can be a logical evolution over time. The more tax gets upstreamed as a department and the less it is then downstream somewhere in a corner putting boxes or numbers in boxes, the CEO is the best stakeholder that can manage the relation between the chief tax officer and the business leaders. Time will tell. Maybe another burning topic, which I think many of us are facing, is the war for talent in the tax domain. We're all struggling to find the right profiles. The inbound of new profiles is getting more and more limited. At the same time, yeah, we all need more specialists in one or the other domain. Can be like in TP or in US tax maybe, or in tax technology, like a data scientist or data management. What is your overall view on the war for talent and how you experience it? Do you have like in general, is it easy for you to hire the right people, or are you struggling a bit? And do you experience that there is a bit of a shortage on the market in terms of good tax profiles?
well, I think, yeah, indeed, it's been a constant challenge. Since I took this role in 2020, I think there has not been any moment that we did not have at least one or more job offers open markets. It's very challenging to find the right people. And it's not in a very specific tax area or region, it's just globally that's what we experience. So it's, first of all, it's very difficult to get good, relevant, I would say, resumes in. Once you get a good candidate, their expectations are pretty high, not only financially, but also content of the role, how they want to work in a team, work from anywhere, work-life balance, this kind of thing. And we may not be able to accommodate all of those. Then even if you have a good candidate, they probably have choices. If you're looking for a job to change, there's probably a lot of choices. So yeah, people, like you always do, we do that as well, weigh off the pros and the cons of each and every one of them. So it's definitely been a constant challenge for us.
Yeah. I always like to think about, it's a bit of a paradox, right? Where we see that on the one hand, the overall importance of tax in society is only increasing, sometimes unfortunate reasons, geopolitical situation, climate change, many global challenges for which tax revenues are required to fund the solutions for those challenges. At the same time, taxes being required to steer behavior in one or the other way. Tax in general being on the rise as a topic in society, it seems that it is more difficult to convince young people of a career in tax. So what is your view? Is this something you agree with? And is there something you can think of where you as tax leader and in general the tax community, what we can do to promote the overall attractiveness of a career in tax, knowing that you have relevance in society? So what is your view on that?
I think ultimately you first need to understand what the reasons are for this, right? That's very difficult, but I fully agree that people may not be that attractive to the tax world. Maybe because, well, maybe because it's too complex and people don't understand it. So they're like, do you want to study something that you don't really understand? Or maybe you don't even know how complex or how interesting it may be. So that's the first thing. And maybe that's something we can try to get to the market and to the general public is saying, hey, it is important and it is so much more than just filling in forms. So making it, so it's more a marketing issue maybe as well. And another thing which I find maybe a reason is over the last number of years, it's getting better again, but a couple of years ago, it was not too easy to work in tax. Everything that had to do with tax and multinationals were considered to be bad. I even recall a short video of the EU or the OECD where they were picturing multinationals not paying their fair share of tax, governments provide proper education and so on and so forth. So it is probably not very appealing for young people to make that step into the tax profession. What can we do about it? We need to educate the general public in media to change that perception, right? And it's not only about reducing taxes as much as possible, but we have a responsibility to support our company to be compliant with all the rules that politicians and everyone have voted, and to pay the fair share of tax. And that's how we contribute to society. So maybe we need to try and let's say market our function a bit better.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think I share the same conclusion there, but the question here is, what can we do? People in tax are always very positive about tax because they know it's very technical. There is constant change. It's challenging. It's like an adventure, I think you are on. You need to deal with so many stakeholders and so many types of tax jobs that every day is different. So people, once they are in tax, love to stay in tax because it is so rewarding, it's challenging, it's good for overall development, I would say. But getting them in tax and making sure that they make the right choices up front to follow that career path, that is the difficulty where I guess one of the big challenges will be for the entire tax community to make sure that this gets tackled so that there is the influx we need.
That is true, because we need to do more and more. So there's much more work into the tax function, being advisors as well as in-house functions. So we need the talent.
Yeah.
Keep the talent as well, of course, right? So
absolutely. As we are by the end of the podcast, almost, like one of the topics I really cherish or like to talk about is the transformation or the future proofing of the tax function. You have had a stable and impressive career already in tax. Can you explain a bit how you have seen the tax function evolving from where you started and where we are right now, like in like the biggest things that you have seen in terms of change and ways of working and overall, let's say, trends? And maybe the more difficult part of the question, where do you expect the tax function is evolving to in the next 3 to 5 years?
We don't have a crystal ball, but at least we know where we're politically, and society-wise it might go. But anyway, if I look back at my relatively long career, indeed, one of the main things that I saw change is the change in transparency. We moved from a relatively, call it, closed environment to a pretty open one. Initially towards tax authorities. You need to provide more and more information, more reports, TP documentation, all that stuff. But now also recently more towards the broader public. So that has changed the responsibilities for the tax function. So now we have to work together with the Marcom teams. Complexity of the tax legislation and the constant change, we talked about that. But another one, of course, is digitization and automation. That has entered the tax function relatively late. The finance and the rest of the operational part of the organization have done that a long time ago with ERP systems and what have you. And in tax, we kept on doing things in Excel and Word and this kind of thing. So really automating routine functions and increasing efficiency, also free up time for more strategic and value add activities. Looking forward to that, of course, that will not change. Digitization will continue. It will also be driven by external stakeholders like digital tax authorities, real-time reporting requirements. And so we will have to make sure that we keep up to date and keep that pace. I'm also very curious about how artificial intelligence will reshape the way we do things in the next 3 to 5 years. Not only in the tax team as such, but the whole organization, I would think, right? Those are a couple of things that have recently changed. And coming back to transparency, I think that will definitely not go away. On the contrary, I think it will probably even go further. And we have some legislation and some requirements are coming our way of public CBCR, but also in the US, the FASB, so the US accounting board, they have issued rules that as of next year, you need to provide even in your financial reporting much more tax information. So anyway, that will continue.
That's interesting. As you said before, we don't have a crystal ball. What we can expect is more regulatory change, geopolitical, macroeconomic change, which always in the end has tax implications, which will impact us as the in-house tax function. For example, will there be, given the geopolitical shifts which we can observe in the world, more harmonization of the tax rules, or will we go back to less harmonization and every country for its own, or maybe groupings of countries where this is against the evolutions we see at OECD level? But the future will bring is also an interesting one to observe, not to mention trade implications between the regions and how this will impact us as tax people.
I think on the income tax and indirect tax like VAT, GST, and so on, there's going to be initially more harmonization. Well, we've seen the rules coming. More countries are adopting the two-pillar approach from the OECD. So what we have seen in Europe over the last number of decades, you see that more global now, I think. Question on what the US will do. so that I don't think that there's going to be like, let's say, a separation again away from harmonization, where countries will go their own way, or blocks like the EU is more on subsidies and incentives. And then the question arises, where do those things sit in an organization? Do they sit with the tax organization, with the legal organization, more into the business? That's something we need to figure out. We have also in Avnet not made a final conclusion on that yet, but sometimes it's kind of like part of a tax code and sometimes it is not. And as I said, in the US, once it's somewhere tax related, you need to deal with it.
No, that's interesting. I'm confident that we tax people will be involved in this type of projects in one way or another, because typically there is some aftercare, like you get something, an incentive, but then there is aftercare or rules that you need to comply with, and specific accounting and tax treatment. So pretty confident that we will be deeply involved. Maybe the final question for you, which is always good for our audience and as a takeaway, what would you in general give as your main piece of advice to our in-house tax audience here? Looking back at your career so far, all the experiences and the ups and downs that you have had, what would you give as a piece of advice to the audience to take away here and hopefully then to apply it going forward?
Don't stay just behind your desk. Reach out. What I found important in my career, and we alluded to it, both in the tax career as just outside, is the importance of a strong network. You need to build that network, not necessarily only in the tax world, but also outside of it. Look at it broadly. Ultimately, you shouldn't be afraid to reach out to your network for advice. I mean, even within tax, you're probably not the only person with a specific problem. In general, in your career, whether it be in tax or not, if you have a good network, even outside of tax, sometimes you can talk about things that bother you. Good mentorship to a certain extent.
Yeah, I like that a lot as a concluding takeaway. It reminds me of a quote I recently read from Esther Perel, which says the quality of our life gets determined about the quality of our relationships. So that is also what you are saying. Have a good network you can rely on tax-wise, but also non-tax-wise. That's maybe then the reason why you are also part of those tax industry groupings, but then also have a very active life outside of tax in your non-profit organizations, right?
True.
Steven, I think it was a very interesting conversation. I have a couple of very good takeaways and learnings that I will take home. I hope the audience had the same feeling. So with this, I want to thank you, Steven, and to the audience, stay tuned for the next episode. Bye.
Welcome. Bye.